everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Outcomes. I'm your host, Barrett King, and today I have a really unique guest with me, somebody on the other side, if you will, of this delightful world that we call partnerships. Chris is a master of ecosystem strategy and training for B2B SaaS. And while I have a little bit of a background in training for a brief stint in my career, Chris lives this stuff every day. So I'm excited to get into a conversation around that. But first and foremost, my friend, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Barrett. Thrilled to be here.
It's my pleasure because you've got something really interesting to talk about. Before we do, the question I ask everyone, I'm sure those that are listening are sick of that phrase, but it's true. I want to focus first on what does partnerships mean to you? And you said it's committing to creating value for the market, shared customers, and partner companies. Do you want to add to it, change it? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think it's spot on. I think the way I was taught to approach partnerships is everything relies on value creation. And if you don't have that as a foundation, it's hard to stand up any form of successful partner program. So, my specialty when I was at an ISV SaaS company was tech partnerships, right? Integrations particularly. And I made the mistake many times, and I see a lot of people make the mistake where you're picking partners to prioritize based on the revenue opportunity that they present to you, but spending very little time at all in understanding what is the value creation that our integration brings towards the market, and really being able to capitalize on that. So that's why I like the concept of approaching partnerships by creating value for your shared customers first, then your partners, and then your own company last, in that order, right? And you too often, in my opinion, see the reverse of that.
Yeah, it's common. I talk to a lot of folks that, I've said this in other episodes, but they'll say something like, so how do I go and build a partner program? I'm like, cool, great. That's an awesome question. Why are you doing this? And when inevitably there's always this answer of, well, I want to resell our software, right? Or like, oh, I want to make sure my customers don't leave. I want to create something stickier. And well, maybe the second one's not so bad, but the first one, leading with what's in it for me, hurts a lot of these relationships before they even get started. So I agree with you there. I'm curious what you've seen in terms of how do you do that differently? How do you not immediately go to market and say, it's about me? You describe this idea of solving for the customer first, thinking about customer value. Anything that you've seen in your experience in this industry that is a good, call it framework or kicking off point for folks as they think about those first initial relationships and those first ideal fits you're describing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What I like to think about is, in terms of partner prioritization, I mentioned earlier that a lot of people, including myself in the past, they make their bets, so to speak, based on the revenue opportunity that partners present, right? But I think if you can go a step further and think not just about the TAM that these potential partners or existing partners are presenting, but really it's the serviceable, obtainable market, SOM, right? That is not, a lot of revenue leaders understand this metric, but not many, early stage partner folks understand that metric. I think if you can look at it through that lens, you can create, the simple 2x2 matrix. And I shared one on LinkedIn recently where it's like, value creation for shared customers on the y-axis and serviceable, obtainable market on the x-axis, meaning, what percent of the TAM that partners are presenting you in terms of opportunity can you realistically capture based on a variety of factors that we could dive into. So I think looking at potential partners or even your existing partners, if you're going about auditing who you're working with and making changes with respect to prioritization, thinking about what you can obtain from a revenue perspective forces you to think about the value creation, because at the end of the day, the value created plays such a disproportionate role in determining what level of a partner's TAM you can actually capture. Because if you have this highly differentiated integration that completely extends the utility of your product in such a way that you can really capitalize it on a marketing perspective, then you're able to be very aggressive, throw all the MDF at it, really engage in some compelling co-selling motions with that partner. Whereas if you have a so-so integration that doesn't really move the needle, you're severely limited in what type of activities you can engage, which thereby lessens your ability to capture that revenue opportunity in the first place.
God, I want to just break all of that apart. That was brilliant and well said. So first, core takeaway, go and follow you on LinkedIn because clearly you're posting really valuable content. Second, obviously, being this idea of really focusing on that intersection of value, which I've talked about before, but I think all too often it's, to your point, the greater TAM, the greater opportunity. How do we drive revenue? How do we close deals? And not focusing on how, by working with your customer and this partner, everyone wins better. Everyone, the better together story that everyone talks about. There's something interesting around this idea that, this framework you're describing could and probably should be taught at scale, should be shared with others. You made a comment before I hit record about bridging the insights to outcomes and sort of process and training component of this. So let's talk about that next, because you've got an extensive background in this part of the partner mechanism in any organization. Let's go high level first and foremost and talk about conceptually what that means to the listener, so that way they can frame out, as we talk in more detail, what we're really getting into today.
Yeah, that's a great tee up for this. So the way I think about insights to outcomes is right now in partnerships landscape, we all have all of the insights we need. We have thought leadership content, more tactically in your role. We have access to data through tools like Crossbeam and Reveal. So we have all of these insights. We certainly know what the outcomes that we're seeking are, that being pipeline creation and net new revenue sourced directly from our partners, things like integration adoption and improving overall NPS and stickiness. But bridging those two, in my opinion, requires process, right? So actual standard operating procedures, user manuals for, playbooks and processes that will ultimately drive those target outcomes, leveraging insights, for instance. But then on top of that, you need training, right? You need practitioners to be sufficiently well-versed and trained up on how to execute and use these playbooks in the first place. And in my experience, an average company will have maybe some good playbooks in place that one person had built once upon a time, and they were able to repeatedly go back to that in order to hit their goals to some extent. And then sometimes you'll have some good training, but you don't necessarily have an innovator who can create a playbook that is easily digestible and used broadly across their organization. But the best companies have both. They have great training and they have these great playbooks, and their reps are able to get trained up on those. And so that's something I'm particularly passionate about, is just this concept of, look, if we can have great playbooks at a given company and ultimately train those reps up on them, that's a great recipe. And it sounds kind of silly to say out loud. It sounds obvious, right? And if you look at sales, it's much more mature in the way of, like, we know what the sales playbooks are. We know what training looks like for sales. It's very formulaic. Add 2 more AEs, put them through this playbook. You're going to get these outputs. That's the future state for partnerships. We're just in the early days of getting to that point.
It's interesting because it is early, and I think you're right. I mean, I have a sales and partnership background, and when I was running training years ago, one of the things we always talked about was the difference between this idea of coaching and training. And what you're kind of evolving this to is saying that, well, we should really think about building the playbooks, the framework for how to go to market, how to operate, how to engage. When you're talking about all of this, though, you're specifically talking about the PDMs and the partner managers, the internal folks, and how they engage with your partners, correct? Just so I frame
Correct.
this. Yeah. Yeah. So in that context, then, if we're talking about building playbooks that capture knowledge, what are some of the ways, like if I'm a listener, right? Let's say I'm a chief partner officer. Let's say that I'm a partner manager, irrespective of title, I'm sitting here hearing you saying, cool, great. But how do I do that? How do I go and capture the most valuable knowledge of how work has been done or should be done in an organization like mine, and then translate that into, we'll start with playbooks. Let's hold off on the training component for a second. How do I start building playbooks at my organization, tomorrow?
Yeah, really good question. So I think first things first is playbooks. You don't need to build a playbook for every single activity that you might execute at any given point. It's really for anything that's you're going to repeat on a frequent basis, something that you're going to rely on. And what I train a lot of people on is this concept of maybe, is there a potential for members on your team across your organization to use it? Right. And that's when you really want to convert this methodology into a bona fide playbook that's very well documented. It's easily discoverable across your organization, and ideally you'll get training on it, which we'll talk about in a second. So if you asked the question about how would you get started, first things first is auditing the list of activities that you run. It's like, is there anything that I do in the given week or given month or given quarter that is routine, is something that I'm going to repeatedly execute, right? So a simple example for a partner manager would be enablement for their partners, right? So like, what's the enablement playbook for our technology and integration partners, right? There's elements in that playbook like lunch and learns. There's account mapping, targeting exercises where you're being strategic and you're trying to identify specific partner employees who manage certain accounts and you want to break into them. So anything that you're going to execute on a routine basis is something you're going to want to have a playbook for. Now, if you can build that on your own, then great. most people don't have training in that regard. So that's why I would advise tapping into existing communities out there, the partnership leaders of the world, where they have legitimate repositories of other people's playbooks and templates to look at, and then ultimately talking to people, connecting with people like yourself, even Barrett, on LinkedIn, and just saying, hey, look, like, what's your approach to building playbooks? Because in my experience, talking to a lot of PMs, partner managers recently, that's an underdeveloped skill, right? This whole idea of documentation, not just for their own sake, but ultimately for other people to use is a lacking skill. So people need a lot of advice and support on how to actually build them in the first place.